All right. So today we're still working on the summation, the first half of the summation anyway, where we were looking at verse 14. And in that one, it was saying that you would not marginalize the deaf and you wouldn't put a stumbling block in front of the blind. Your reverence for the deaf and the blind comes from your reverence of God. And hopefully you guys remember that. But this deafness is a two-tiered thing in the biblical world. You can physically be deaf where you can't hear at all or are mostly deaf, I mean, they probably still call you back then if everybody had to scream to hear you said, but, you're thinking more of someone who can't hear. But it's also someone who can't hear the truth. You lay it out for them and show them, the history, the customs, the culture, and all of this, pertinent information as to why what that person believes is correct. They can't hear it. It just it goes in one ear and out the other. There's no comprehension of what was just said to them. That's the deaf. And then it's the same thing. The blind are the same way. And the Bible talks about this. They have eyes, uh, but they do not perceive. They have ears, but they do not comprehend. They do not hear. Um, it's really saying the same thing twice. To have eyes, but you don't perceive. You have ears, but you don't hear, is essentially saying the same thing twice. They would call that a doublet these days, although that Jews wouldn't have called it that back in the biblical days. It's essentially the same thing, though. You've shown them everything verbally. Maybe you even sat down and drew out a little timeline, like I did recently with the guy. I sat down and showed him that there is a vast 181 years of time missing between the end of the writing of the New Testament letters and the beginning of what is now known as Christianity. There's 181 years missing. Nothing is there. And there are people that would jump up and down and say, oh, but they're the Nicene fathers, the ante-Nicene fathers, blah, blah. No, they were not Christians. It did not exist. That part did not exist. The Christianity thing, it started with Catholicism after the winning of Constantine's war, and even then, it wasn't what we would think of as Catholicism, because they were still worshiping the sun god. They were not worshiping Jesus. That none of that happened right away. That is what Jerome turned it into, and that you're getting into the 400s when that happened. The very, very early, like 401. I mean, it's early when he finishes his Vulgate, or maybe it's 403, but it was very early 400s. And so he finishes that up. And at that point, the whole Jesus thing becomes a reality, because uh, I'll just give you some information here just quickly. Constantine, after winning the war, decided to build an arch in commemoration of winning that war. Now, if you go and you look at that arch, and it's very close to the Colosseum, very, very close. We're talking walking distance for a guy like me. And I can't walk that far. I'll get all worn out because of my heart. It hurts my hips and it hurts every other part of my body. I could even walk there. It's that close. Well, if you go up and you look at it, there's no fish. There's no chi in a row. Do you guys know what the chi in the row is? That's what in the 900s CE or AD, if you will. That's when that idea first was thrown out there, long after the fact, by somebody who couldn't possibly have known about some dream that Constantine had. In other words, it's utterly made up. That Constantine saw this vision of the chi in the row, the chi being an X, if you will. It looks like an X that stood for Christ, and the row, which looks like a P. I have no idea what that stands. I don't even remember what that stands for anymore. But it was, the Jesus Christ thing, and he had this thing in this vision as he was getting ready to go into battle, and he knew he couldn't win. So he said, I will follow that God and that banner will be ours and we will be a Christian nation, as if Christianity existed at that time, which it did not. And so the story goes. Well, what did Constantine do? He builds this thing to commemorate his winning of that battle. There's no Chi, there's no Rho, there's no mention of the fish, there's no mention of Christianity, as again, it did not exist. There are no what could be looked at symbolism on there that could be thought of as Christian in any way, shape, or form. But there is 2 or 3 carved, graven images of Mithra, the sun god, and then there's that other sun god that's above Mithra. He's at the top, and that's a carving as well. These are all graven images, by the way, and it's all about sun worship. No inkling of anything that could be considered Catholic or Christian, no inkling of it. That's how he chose to commemorate the winning of his war, because it had nothing to do with, oh no, I lost the very important piece of paper. It just flew out of my hand. So anyway, you can sit down and you can do what I did and start somebody at the end of the first century, and you can show them that it's not until the 400s that you get the Greek New Testament letters that were ultimately turned into the English Bible. There are no letters that predate that. There's a couple of fragments, and very small ones at that some scholars have tried to push as early as the 150. You're still not getting to the time of the disciples. This is a long, it's 120 years after the fact at the earliest piece of small piece of fragment that you have. And the funny thing is, I looked at those fragments, and here's what strikes me real funny. This is supposed to be a fragment, something that was written front and back, and somehow you got part of the verse on the front, and when you flip it over, there's the other part of the verse. That ought to tell you that this is fake as it gets. But everybody's like, oh no, it's real. No, if you were writing these verses out in Greek, in let's say, I don't remember what part of the book it was, but let's say it's Mark chapter 4, verse 1, 2, 3, 4, and you're at verse 4, and you've got part of verse 4 here, and then you flip it over and you have the rest of verse 4 on the next page. Shouldn't that tell you that's not real? And those are the fragments that they're talking about. So it's nonsense. There is nothing before the 400s. Oh my God, that means Christianity isn't real. Well, there are those who have said that. My argument is this: 400 years after the first century, these copies and these fragments are found or gathered together. I mean, maybe people knew where they were. I don't know. But they are gathered together, and they start funneling through this stuff and start trying to make it into a document that others can read. They're trying to figure out, okay, well, here's a fragment of, Mark chapter 1, and over here is a smaller fragment that looks like it's part of chapter 1, and they just kind of put this stuff together and wrote this stuff out. Now, some of them were full documents. They weren't just fragments, but actually most of it was fragments. But some of them were big fragments, not little ones. And then I think maybe the majority were small, but they did their best, right? Well, here's the interesting thing, because I really began to doubt this as I was going through and translating the New Testament letters. I had a lot of doubts going in, but my doubts really began to stack up as I went through this. But here was the phenomenal thing, the thing that finally struck me about it. There is no way that a bunch of Greek philosophers, and these were Greek philosophers, there was no Christianity at, well, I guess in the 400s there, you could call it, there was Catholicism as it was known then, because again, you're talking about the very early days. They didn't even have the idea of a pope at this point, right? Because that happens in the 450s. when they come up with the whole idea that Peter was the first pope. That idea didn't exist until the 450s. So then they had to go back and write, go backwards and kind of reverse engineer, put names in there to fill in who the popes were from Peter down to this first guy that ultimately got named as pope. So there's a lot of iffy stuff going on here, but they're not the ones that wrote it. They're just the ones that took it and did something with it, right? And so the stuff that's written, it's been worked on over the years, and we do have a fairly good compilation of this Greek text. And here's what's amazing. This Greek text utterly hides an idiomatic dialect of Hebrew. That's why nobody's ever figured it out, because they're trying to call it Koine Greek, which means perverted, by the way, perverted Greek. And so they try to, you try to learn Bible Greek and regular Greek, and Bible Greek never makes any sense to anyone who knows regular Greek, because it's so weird, right? The sentences make no sense. You can't even understand a large portion of those sentences. You can't make heads or tails out of them. So what do? You go with, well, what did the last guy say? And he went with, well, what did the other guy say? And the guy before went, well, what did the other guys? And so we just keep saying the same thing because nobody knows what to do with it. And Jerome, being the first guy who came up with the ideas to fill in the blanks and make understandable sentences out of what in Greek are not understandable at all. He added sentences that shouldn't be there. He took some away that obviously should be there. He mixed and mingled things together, and he came up with something very coherent. But even with that, even though the New Testament translations have very closely followed that work, even Erasmus, who wrote the Textus Recepticus, and I know I'm pronouncing his name wrong, don't really care. I think he deserves it. But anyway, I'll be upset if I find out I am pronouncing it right, but I don't think I am. But this guy, he goes out and he writes this Greek text, and he claims that he used three Greek texts for the most part that did not exist. Now they're saying, oh yeah, I'll see, he used these two, but here in the book of Revelation, there toward the end, it's obvious that he borrowed a little bit there from the Latin Vulgate, but the rest of it would come from the other. Well, I sat down with his work right next to the Latin Vulgate, and I actually compared them, and he took it from the Latin Vulgate, all of it. I don't care what anybody says. I actually sat there and read them side by side. He just took it from the Latin Vulgate. Anywho, it still amazes me that behind all of this, even though all of this came together in the way that it did, there should be no coherence here. There should be nothing should work. Everything, there should just be one, what am I looking for? Discrepancy after another. That you should have one sentence should sound like, oh, the law is good and perfect and pure, like Paul said. And then in the same sentence, it should say, oh, but we're not under the law, we're under grace, which Paul did as well. Well, if you look at the Greek text and you understand that this is Greek hiding the idiomatic dialect of Hebrew that was spoken in the first language, well, all I got to do is put the Hebrew words in place of the Greek words. And if you understand the idiomatic formation of that language, then you've got a perfectly formed Hebrew sentence. And the whole New Testament's like that. The work of Paul, not so much. It's more difficult to do his work because it was a better Greek translation than any of the rest of it was. But, once you figure that kind of stuff out, here's what's amazing. Somehow, these Greek philosophers who knew nothing about the history, the customs, the culture, the language, they knew none of those things. They were not translating Hebrew text into Greek. They were trying to fix the Greek text. They were just rewriting Greek text is all they were doing. Or rewriting Latin text. That there was nothing beyond that. There was no translating the original documents because none of them ever had the original documents. Those have still never been found. And so there are those that say, oh, that proves the New Testament isn't real. Okay, well, sorry, Mr. Jew. Um, we've never seen the document Moshe wrote or any of the rest of the writers of what we now call the Tanakh. We don't have an original of any of those, right? The originals just aren't there for us to look at. What we have are copies of copies of copies. Now, the Jews doing the in Hebrew, their scribes did a phenomenal job because you have the Dead Sea Scrolls are literally 1,000 or more years older than the Masoretic text. The Masoretic text is where we get the English translation of the what the Christians call the Old Testament, the Tanakh, and that's literally where most of the well, all of the work up until just a few years ago. If you have a Jewish Bible that has been translated into English, that's based on the Masoretic text. So that's only 1,000 years old. But you find another text, the Dead Sea Scrolls, that's 1,000 years older than that, and they're almost identical. The only differences that you really find are just in the Jews had a different groups would spell certain people's names differently, because if you took uh, Antiochus Epiphany, which means God manifest, the Jews would call him Antiochus Epiphanani or something like that, and it meant the buffoon who thinks he's God or something like that. I'm sorry, I don't remember exactly how that goes. I ran across that and told you about it years ago, and now I just don't remember it. But it's something like that. That was real common. The Jews did that all the time. They would change the spelling of a name to, I don't know, just kind of an artistic thing that they did. Those are the changes that we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's really nothing beyond that. They're all but identical. So that tells you that those scribes rather, were very careful in how they transcribed. New Testament stuff, for it to have come out this well, this accurate in its history, in its customs, in its culture, if it's translated right, it's amazing. Absolutely amazing. Because these uh, men who did this, pagan idol worshippers who did this, philosophers, they were all philosophers, not Christians, not Catholics, but philosophers. How could they possibly have known any of that? It's impossible for them to have known any of that. So somehow, and perhaps by the hand of God himself, I don't know if I want to go that far and say that God did that, because I don't really know that it would be important enough that I don't see God thinking it that important. Because when the disciples were alive, they didn't have a New Testament. These are letters that they wrote here and there. And if you followed Paul, you would never know what Peter said or Matthew said, or, you're in different regions of the land. You're only going to get one or two of these letters. It's going to be from the guy that's over your group. So you wouldn't have known about any of that other stuff. These guys didn't get together and say, hey, let me use your letters so I can teach Matthew, verse 1, verse chapter 4, verse 1. They didn't do that. They taught from the Hebrew Bible, what the Christians call the Old Testament. So if they were able to teach all of that stuff and bring all these people into the knowledge of Mashiach, why does anybody today need a New Testament? And I'm serious about that. The disciples didn't use it. The New Testament as we know it, the argument went on for 300 years. They didn't want to put the second letter of Peter in there, because in that one it said that if you weren't trained by a rabbi like they were, You couldn't possibly understand a single word that Paul spoke. And so they didn't want that in there. None of them wanted the book of Revelation in there, because their fear was people are going to look at this letter that was written about things that have already taken place and think that it's stuff in the future. They were right. That's exactly what the church does today. They're thinking that this book talking about things that have already taken place, they're waiting for that stuff to happen, and they're looking at all this stuff in the news and all the, they're still looking for the end of days, which took place. Well, you guys know what I mean. But in 390, almost hit the time of 400. You're in the time where Jerome is working very hard to put this Latin Vulgate together. He's by 390, but I don't know how far he is into it by 390. I know he finished in the early 400s, so he was well into it, I would think, because that would have been a hard thing to do back in his day. He didn't have a computer, and he didn't have a typewriter, and he didn't have a way to format all this kind of stuff. So this was all done by hand, and it would have been slow and tedious. Totally forgot what I was saying. Oh no. Anyway, sorry about that. I went off on memory lane and got lost. You can tell people all of this stuff. You can point out that what we know as the church today literally has no connection to the disciples. What the church teaches has almost no connection to what the disciples taught. There is a bit of truth in it, in that Yeshua, not Jesus, his name was Yeshua. He came, it was God in human flesh, not the bouncing baby boy son of God, but God himself who came in human flesh. He laid down his life not to save all of the so-called Christians. No, it had nothing to do with that. He came here to reinstate the covenant with Israel. He said that with his own mouth, according to the New Testament. He also said, I did not come for anyone but the Jews. Yeah, I am not come but for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. I did not come for anyone but the Jews. Right? You can tell these people this, and because they go to church and everybody gets so emotional and people start talking with stammering lips, and they come in and there are people who go to church and they've been an addict of some sort for years, and they come to the church and they give their life to Jesus and they get off of drugs. And so to them, that's a miracle. God has touched this person. How can you say this isn't real? How can you say this isn't God? Well, because clinically, using clinical psychology, I can tell you how I can say that, because you don't stop being an addict just because you stopped taking drugs or drinking or whatever your addiction is, because you've stopped that. You replace it. You don't stop it, you replace it. So when people come into the church and they hear about this person who laid down his life for all the awful things that they ever did, and if you just say this little prayer, you will be absolved of all of your sins, and you get to start afresh, and he'll help you not to be, on those drugs or that alcohol or that porn or whatever it is. And it is so compelling, and there's a sliver of truth here, of actual truth from God here. It's not the whole truth, but there's a sliver of truth in there, and truth is truth. It's going to have an impact. And so what they do is they trade that addiction to whatever it is that they're addicted to the addiction to the Jesus thing. And that's not a terrible thing if you think about it. It's better that somebody believe in Jesus and that he died for their sins, and that all of this emotional stuff that they do is real. It's better they do that than they do drugs, than they do whatever the other thing is that they're addicted to. This is better. but it's a trade-off. It's not a miracle. And so most of the stuff that happens in the church, statistically speaking, just go and look at Billy Graham's work that he did. He kept track of everybody who came down and got saved at all of his rallies, and every year it was the same names over and over and over again, because it's temporal for most people. For some people, it's not temporal. Why can they change over and stop the alcoholism or the drugs or whatever it is and not ever go back to it? Because they found something more important to them than that addiction. The addiction's still there. If they go back and start drinking or, shooting up or snorting or whatever, they'll get lost in that thing immediately, because addiction is an alcohol. Addiction to drugs and alcohol, that is a physiological thing. You have a chemical problem inside your body that causes that. Other people don't. They can drink alcohol and take it or leave it. It doesn't make any difference to them. They can take a drug, once or twice while they're in college and then never touch them again, because they didn't have that chemical imbalance. The people who have the chemical imbalance, you can't do anything about that. There's no pill that will fix that. Maybe one day there will be, but there is not currently. But when you find something that is more important to you than that addiction, you can trade that addiction for that which is more important. For some people, it's their children. It's their marriage to the one that they love more than their own life, which is why children are so effective in that for so many people, because parents tend to love their children more than they love their own life. That will trade your addiction immediately, if not sooner, if you under the right circumstances. And Christianity gives you that. But you also have to understand that the Muslim religion gives you the same thing. The Hindu religion gives you the same thing. So religion overall is actually a good thing any way you look at it, because it can take people out of that dark place and put them in a much brighter place. But so you can talk about all that kind of stuff from a clinical psychological viewpoint, or you can talk about it from the historical viewpoint and all of this kind of stuff, and still nobody will listen to you. And why am I saying all this? Because I'm some clinical psychologist? No, I got this from a clinical psychologist, okay? Dr. Jordan B. Peterson, to be specific. But here's why it's important here. It says you will not marginalize the deaf. So the person who's heard all of this stuff that I just said about what's real and what isn't, can't hear it. I wrote it down on a piece of paper or made them write it down on a piece of paper. I've done it both ways. It's ineffective either way. They can't see it. They can't hear it. They're just deaf and blind. That just no way that can they have this. So you could, someone like me, I could take somebody, particularly a Pentecostal, and I understand this because Pentecostals where I came from, started off Jewish and then wound up in church, and it was a Pentecostal holiness church. So I get the whole Pentecostal holiness thing because I spent a lot of years in that church in my youth. There's this very strong push toward everybody's got to get the Holy Ghost. And I'm saying that in quotations, because their idea of the Holy Ghost does not match the Bible at all. You could say, well, it matches the translation. Well, that's fine. That's not the Bible. Most people have never in their life ever read the Bible. I read mine every day. No, you don't. You read a translation. And that translation is not worth the paper it was written on. Sorry, it's just not. Even the Jewish Study Bible has some whoppers of mistakes, and they're made on purpose because they don't want to give Christians ammunition. So they go in and just change a lot of stuff. And I just think it's dishonest. What, you think God can't handle this? Anyway, let's get off of that. But this is important because I could take a Pentecostal and set him down, and within 5 minutes, regardless of whether he's deaf, blind, and irritable, I can prove to him that the Holy Spirit is not what he thinks it is, not even remotely what he thinks it is. But to what end? See, this would be the stumbling block. Because what do you do, particularly if you've got a Pentecostal who's totally into the whole holy roller thing, and and the emotional side of things, and believes that all of these miracles are real and all that kind of stuff. I'm not saying that there are no real miracles. I'm just saying that 99.9% of them aren't real. Uh, they're just emotion based. People come up and say, I have cancer, and they pray for them, and they announce, oh, see, this person is healed, and a year later that person is dead. I'm sorry, if God would have healed that person of cancer, they would not have died of it a year later. So it's not real. And that's been my experience. Look at the work that Billy Graham did. You'll see that that's, statistically speaking, it's real high that it's not real. Anyway, but if I take and destroy the I'm thinking of one guy in particular because we had this conversation last night, but I'm thinking of somebody else that I think of, a person who actually was on drugs, came to church, gave their life to God. God, I can think of like 4 people that, just off the top of my head, that did this very same thing. A couple of them were alcoholics. Actually, 3 of them were alcoholics. One of them, I think, did drugs. And I'm not even sure about that. It may have been alcohol, but I think it was drugs. So I mean, I got all these people bouncing through my head all of a sudden. So, but they come to church, and okay, I know I can actually give you a name. Tom Cook. I actually remember his name, Donna. We were talking about them last night, but I couldn't think of his name. Tom Cook was, I think his was alcohol. I don't remember for sure, but I think it was alcohol. And he came into church, and he went down to the front after hearing the message about Jesus loving him and dying for him and all that kind of stuff, which is true. That part of the message is true. So he goes down to the front, and he gives his life to God, and he never picked up another drink. Right? So he has traded his alcohol addiction for a Jesus addiction. Well, again, I'm saying that's not a bad thing, because I don't think Christians are going to hell. All right. I hope you guys know that. I don't think that that's a death sentence, an eternal death sentence for anybody. I think that they're missing out on the bigger picture, and missing out on the very thing that they all really, really want, because they're so hung up. Like Paul said, you got to get beyond this Jesus thing. Paul said that. It's in the New Testament. And move on to, of course, because of the way it was translated, they don't realize he's talking about Torah observance. He actually said that in the Greek. You just don't get to read that in the English. But you got to move on. This is a great thing to draw you to God, but it's not where you're supposed to stay. That's supposed to just open the door and get you on the path. But if I go in there and I take somebody like Tom, if I were to somehow prove to him that Jesus wasn't real, his name was Yeshua, and it wasn't the Son of God, it was God, and this Holy Spirit is actually the Word of God, not something that makes you stammer and with your, and say things that nobody can understand with your lips and roll around on the floor. If I actually took and proved to him that basically isn't really serving the real God or something, because that's how he would take that, I'm sure. I know I can say this about him because this is his testimony, and he's perfectly fine with that. And hopefully he won't get mad at me once I find, because I'm pretty sure he's okay with me using his name. But if I did that, if I suddenly made him think that his God wasn't real, what happens when he falls over that stumbling block? Well, probably right back to the alcohol. I'm pretty sure it was alcohol with him. I never can remember who did the alcohol and who did the drugs. I think his was drinking. I'm pretty positive it was. But if you do that to somebody, you can destroy a life. So when you're being told don't marginalize the deaf and the blind, you got to be careful with this. But here's what is written on that piece of paper that I lost. You going home and talking with your wife about this, you had an experience with someone like this, and they've said that you've laid it all out. They couldn't hear it. Is it on back? Are we back? Okay, you've laid it all out. You've tried to get them to understand that, look, you're not telling them that Jesus isn't real. You're not telling them that there was no Messiah. You're not telling them that they are not going to heaven. You're not telling them that. That's what I can't seem to get past. I can't tell the truth without them automatically going there. Well, then everybody I know is going to hell. It's always heaven or hell. And Yeshua said there's one thing that's going to keep you out of heaven. One thing, but somehow everything you say is a heaven or hell issue. And so I've not figured out how to talk to a Christian about this kind of stuff. I really haven't. I've been a total failure at this because I can't get past their religiosity, the things that they have learned that are so wrong. Because they think that if I say this is wrong, then everything is wrong. No, I'm not doing that. I'm just trying to, instead of living with a little bit of truth, how about living with the whole truth? You have no idea how freeing the whole truth is. You think you're free after getting a little bit of it? What do you think is going to happen when you get the whole thing? And it's available to everybody. Everybody. God's no respecter of person. So if you get home and you're talking about, oh, I laid it all out and I tried to talk this guy and he just wouldn't listen to me, and he got all beside himself. Next thing I know, he's calling me a lying demon out of the pit of hell, because I get that a lot, or used to anyway. You're not marginalizing this person. You're not putting a stumbling block in this person. How do I know? Because he's not there. This is what you do with that person. The conversations that you have between you and your wife, you are one. It's, you're thinking out loud. She's thinking out loud. You're having a conversation, and you need to have these conversations. You need to talk it through and get it off your mind so that it doesn't build up and you blurt something out that causes somebody to stumble right back into addiction. You do not ever want to do that to somebody. So and that's in a very extreme case here. This isn't just covering the extreme. It's covers everything. You don't want to say something or do something that they could say, yeah, see there, that guy's not real. So if you're going to tell them something about the Bible, you need to know absolutely for sure that what you're about to say is correct. And if you're not positive, don't say it. The argument's not that important. You can't draw anyone to God in the first place. Only God can draw somebody to himself. So it's not our job to do that. Anyway, so hopefully you guys know the difference between actually marginalizing somebody and having a conversation about something that has happened with your spouse. And these are probably not if you're talking about stuff like this, probably not the kind of conversations you should be having in front of your children either. This needs to be a, private thing, because you're not supposed to gossip either. So you don't want to cross that line either. But just talking about, what's happening, what you're thinking is not gossiping. Gossip is going to be with somebody other than your spouse. I'm going to leave it at that. That's an oversimplification, I'm sure, but let's leave it at that. I've spent way too much time on that. So let's look at the number 15. You shall not do anything unjust. Well, that's pretty simple. Nothing unjust. You shall not extend special treatment to the lowly. You shall not show favoritism to the great. You shall judge everyone righteously. Well, that sounds pretty simple, right? But you know what we do? Whoever we like, our God likes. Whoever we dislike, our God dislikes. Whatever we do is acceptable to God, and whatever somebody else does to us is never acceptable to God, right? It's really easy for us to what's the word I'm looking for? To explain away our hypocrisy, to explain away our bad behavior, to explain away our Torah non-observance. It's very easy for us to do. It's very easy. Well, nobody saw that, so I'm just going to go on like it never happened. That person's never going to be in my life again, so no one's ever going to know I said that or did that or whatever, right? It's real easy to be unjust when no one's looking. It's real easy to show favoritism to the poor. There are verses in the Bible that speak about you don't show favoritism to a poor because it's a David versus Goliath thing. If Goliath is right, Goliath is right. David doesn't get to have a big payday just because he's a poor little soul and Goliath has a whole bunch of money. We're not supposed to do that. It happens all the time, but it shouldn't. You don't show favoritism to the great. I actually saw I don't know if he was a senator or a congressman. I do know he was a Democrat. I don't know that matters, but yeah, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, he was a Democrat, but he was talking about security at the time. And some of you may know who I'm talking about. I kind of doubt it. This happened several years ago. But he was saying that because of the position that he held, either a senator or a congressman, I don't remember, that people like him absolutely deserved to have armed people protecting him, while the people who voted him into office didn't deserve that because they weren't on his level. And I was stunned. The guy just came right out and said it right into the camera. And so this is a person that's the great, because he's great, not meaning that he's a great person, but that he's reached a great level. You have reached a position of great authority and great power and all that kind of stuff. And so he's the great, right? Well, this is the great showing favoritism to the great. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about we're not supposed to show favoritism to the great. We as a people should not allow somebody to be like that. We should vote that person out, or vote against the bill that they're proposing. I think it was about a bill. I don't remember. I just remember how shocked I was that somebody would literally say that in front of a camera, knowing that's going to be on national television that day or that evening. But he did. Just total arrogance, right? Well, we're not talking about what he did. He was showing favoritism to himself. It's the people, if they let something like that happen, oh yeah, well, he is important, so we should treat him with that kind of, treat him differently because he's so important. No, he's just a man. He puts his pants on the same way every other man does. He walks the same way every other man does. He's just a man. Just like the poor guy, the lowly guy like me, who what have we got? 10 people that dial in every week at most. I'm the lowly, right? uh, I I'm just a man, just like that guy. And that's why God sees it. He doesn't see that that guy has done anything great. He doesn't see that I've done anything insignificant. We're just his children, and he loves us all, and he treats us all exactly the same, and he expects us to do the same thing. So we don't give some poor guy an advantage just because he's poor and that guy can afford to lose a little here and there. We don't do that. And we don't give some guy privileges just because he's reached some great position of authority. Maybe he's a judge or a police officer. That's a pretty powerful position if you stop and think about it. You don't treat them differently. They don't get to have things that other people don't have. That's wrong. Everything needs to be um, balanced. Balanced. Now, that's not to say I'm a socialist. I'm not at all. You don't take from the rich and give to the poor. This verse tells us not to do that, because you're taking from the rich is theft, for one thing, because the rich person earned that. He did not steal it. He did not oppress other people to get it. He did his work diligently. He got a bunch of money. It's his. Leave it alone. Go make your own money. But if you take that money from the rich guy and you give that money to the poor guy, God's saying, no, you don't do that. That's wrong. It's sin. So we don't take from the rich and give to the poor. It is wrong. Now, if the rich guy wants to give to the poor, that's a good thing. If the people in the middle want to give to the poor, that's a good thing. Poor giving to the poor, I have some doubts about that. And certainly poor giving to the rich, the whole Christian, give me your money and God will make you rich. Oh, I find that abhorrent. That is a horrific distortion of God. It is just horrific. And these guys, at least one of them that I know of, is now a billionaire. Really, how did he get $1 billion if everybody's given to God? How's that winding up in his personal bank account? Still, though, I hit the thing. Do we still have sound? Still, though, if he's taking that money and putting it in his personal account, I don't think it's our government's business. I think it's up to the Christians ought to put a stop to that. Not the government, the Christians. Just like I think the Christians ought to be the one that feed the poor. It's not bad that the government tries to help out, but I think that the government ought to stop having government programs for the poor and start just giving that money to the different Christian organizations and let them take care of it. Just my thoughts. Anyway, not terribly important. So we don't show favoritism. It doesn't say we can't show favoritism to ourselves, although there are laws that say that. This one does not. It's just about us having a good, balanced approach to everything. Let's see. Okay, here, the next one is going to get us into gossip. I'm running, I show 11 minutes. What do you about that? I'm going to go ahead and get into it, and we'll pick back up with it next week. I'm sorry, my throat is really hurting. Okay, it says, you shall not participate in spreading slander or gossip. The word's the same in Greek and Hebrew. Those two words are the same word. Yeah, you can have different words, no doubt, but generally gossip and slander are the same. It says, you don't do that among your people. You shall not defend the guilt of anyone. And I've seen this. I saw a man, a real famous man, who said something he just should not have said. He was in the wrong. It was mean-spirited and just ugly all around. So then the next day he gets two guys that work for him. This was a TV guy, and he gets two guys that work for him, spent more than an hour sitting there defending what this guy did. Well, that's not really what he meant by that. What he meant was this, and it's not, I know he said that, but what he meant to say was that, and they just tried to cover it up, and he just let them do all the handiwork. They shouldn't have done that according to this, right? Because they're defending the guilt of somebody. The man was guilty, and he should have just said, I lost my head. I said something I shouldn't have said. I'm sorry. That would have been fine. That would have been great. That's what he should have done, but he didn't. He got his little henchman to go over there and argue the dumbest arguments I've ever heard. They were having trouble coming up with something, but they were trying to sell it. They really were. And that's a shame, because he's otherwise a really decent fellow. He's actually a good man, does good things. And but anyway, we're not supposed to do that. If we know that somebody is guilty, we shouldn't be lying for them. We shouldn't be helping to cover up what they've done. We, lawyers have to do that apparently, but we lowly people should never participate in that. And gossip and slander, we really need to look into what gossip and slander is. I know that we've already gone through the words, but I think that next week maybe we'll just take a quick moment to discuss those words. When you're talking to your spouse about something that's going on in life, with some experience you had with somebody, that's not gossip. It's not slander. It's when it steps outside of that realm and you're talking to other people about it. You're sitting, in your, we used to have a joke we used to tell when we were growing up in the Pentecostal church. People would get up and literally gossip as a form of giving a testimony. Well, so-and-so was sleeping around with so-and-so's wife, and I prayed for them, and God got them out of that, and it was just gossip. It was just a gossip session. And we used to just make a joke about it, because it wasn't everyone that did that. There was just always 2 or 3 people that always did something like that. What their testimony was always gossip. And what were you going to do? Tell them, shut up? I don't know. The pastor wouldn't do it. And of course, we couldn't. We weren't in that position. But the funniest one that ever happened was this lady got up, and she was an older lady. She had to be pushing 90. She was really up there. And she got up and she said, please pray for so-and-so. Her has been running around on her and gallivanting off with this other lady. And she was naming names and all this. And most of us were doing this. And there was a group of girls right behind the pew she was sitting on. And they are just leaning over on the pew, trying to hide their faces, got their hands over their mouths. They're trying not to burst out in laughter. It was all the characters on the soap opera. The woman thought it was real, apparently. I would say that kind of gossip is acceptable. Anyway, because that hurt no one. Those people were not real. Those events were not real, unfortunately, but she got up there and just laid it all out there. Anyway, gossip hurts somebody. Gossip can come around and bite even the gossiper, and it often does. Slander is even worse. We think of them as 2 different things, but slander is you're trying to hurt someone's not personality, character. You're tearing that person down, and this is Twitter through and through. This is, as far as I can tell, I've never actually been on TikTok, but what I've seen and heard about TikTok seems to be TikTok through and through. This is all of these people running around trying to destroy other people simply because they don't have, don't accept their thinking is different. One person thinks A and the other person thinks B, therefore person B must be destroyed. And they do that through slander. That is a terrible thing to do. And if you're a child of God, you found yourself chiming in on something like that, time to stop. Time to maybe make a sin sacrifice. I've got just enough time. I want to say something about that in case it's not clear. I think it is, but in case it's not, we have begun to make the sacrifices. We're only up to 2 at this point. We're trying to work our way through it. I'm trying to make sure that we do it according to the Bible, and we do the sin sacrifice. And it is a very difficult sacrifice for everyone who's actually done it in person. It's very difficult. It's very emotional. Do we do this so that your sin will be forgiven? No, no. And I believe that Paul was trying to tell you that there was never a time when the sin sacrifice ever brought forgiveness, because that's not what the Bible says. It says that there is a covering. If you've killed somebody, that's a sin. And that sin is with you for all eternity. Moses is still a murderer. David is still a murderer. He's still a womanizer. He's still an adulterer. It never goes away. But there's a covering. And it used to be they would sacrifice animals and you would be covered for a whole year. That was it. You had to go and make that sacrifice again the next year, because God knows full well that you will not go a whole year without committing sin. It's not going to happen. So then if you believe in Mashiach, or if you believe in God, you should believe this. It's not so much about believing in Mashiach. And if you believe in God, God said he would make a sacrifice, and that sacrifice would be the final sacrifice. And so whether you believe it's already taken place or not, that doesn't matter. If God said it, it's done. Whether it happened 2,000 years ago or 2 bazillion years from now, if that's even a real thing, I don't know. I don't even know if it's true. Anyway, if God said it, it's done. So there has been a sacrifice. And that sacrifice was the one-time ultimate sacrifice, that there needs to be no more sacrifice. How's that? I need to just put some super glue on it. Anyway, what was I talking about? Something about the sacrifice. Oh, we don't make these sacrifices so that we can be forgiven for some sin. That was taken care of by God. We do the sacrifices for the very reason God said to do the sacrifices, to remember. When you're sacrificing a lamb and knowing that that lamb's life was lost because of your sin, that lamb is now going to, be consumed because of your sin, and you're the one, well, your rabbi is the one in this case that has to consume the thing, but you make that sacrifice, it makes it more personal when you have to say those words and you realize that because of what you've done, an animal's life has been taken. An innocent animal's life has been taken because of what you've done. It helps you to understand the sacrifice that God has to make, or did make, to reinstate the covenant between himself and his people. It's for a remembrance. It does nothing for your sin. God has already taken care of it. That's why the sacrifices should still be going on to this day. We don't need a temple sitting on the Temple Mount. The tabernacle wasn't on the Temple Mount. Why not just build another tabernacle? I mean, one to scale. They always build them a third of scale or something like that. Just build a real one, But those guys that can prove somehow that they're in the line of Aharon, put them in there so that the people, I'm trying to find this thing, sorry, so that the people can remember. That's all I got today. Shalom, shalom. The blessing, vaYiqra. Begish meracha. Ya'er Yahweh panai v'lecha v'hunacha. Yisa Yahweh panai v'lecha v'yasim lecha shalom. And in English, may Yahweh cause you to lie down so that you may rest. May he touch and caress you. May he prepare you for what is ahead. May he watch over you. May he keep you from harm. May he cause goodness to grow in you and take away the bad. May he arrange your life and cause you to flourish. May he cheer you up and gladden your heart. May he cause his light to shine through you. May he show you tenderness and favor and love in his presence. May he show you kindness and be delicate towards you. May he show you his generosity, mercy, compassion, and desire for you as it comes forth from the depths of his soul. May he lift you out of your pit and deliver you from the things that hold you prisoner. May he draw you to his chest and cast his eyes on yours. May he show you his love and desire for you as he cradles you in his arms. May he bear your punishment and pardon you of your sin. May he take you for his bride. May he establish a foundation in you. May he place his name on your heart and mind and make your body his temple. May you be his treasure. May you always be on his mind. May he draw you near and comfort you when you are afraid. May he assure you there is nothing to fear because he is with you. May you and all that concerns you be at peace because he is your friend. Amen.